Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for an overview of the new National Community Action Partnership Public Policy Priorities for 2023-2024. My name is Ryan Gelman, and I am the Director of Public Policy and Advocacy here at the partnership. We may be joined by Denise Harlow, our CEO, in a little bit, and if she pops in, we'll pin her in case she wants to say a few words. And we're also joined by Tessa Schneider. She's our new public policy intern. She's behind the scenes controlling the slides. So thank you, Tessa. And we can go to the next slide. So we always like to start with the community action promise. I always imagine it like a statute like this. So community action changes people's lives, embodies the spirit of hope, improves communities, and makes America a better place to live. We care about the entire community, and we are dedicated to helping people help themselves and each other. Next slide, please. So this is what we're going to talk about today. We have a bit to get through, so we can just run down this list. We're going to do an overview of the review process that we use to update the policy priorities, the overall platform, and then the actual priorities themselves, a bit about the rest of the project, and then some questions, hopefully, and some resources. Next slide, please. So when we started this process, we were looking for a more inclusive, sort of like robust, comprehensive review process for figuring out what our policy priorities were going to be for 2023-24. So we organized a series of national listening sessions that corresponded to different topics within the policy priorities. We also had an anonymous survey that folks could fill out that was open for about 5 or 6 months. We got pretty good traction on all of these. Overall, we received input or feedback from over 100 individuals and organizations, including stakeholders, obviously the NCAP board, staff, folks at the agencies, and other partners. Next slide, please. And actually, Denise just joined us, so I might just hand it over for a moment, just in case she wants to say a few words here.
Thanks, Ryan.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Sorry for being late, everybody. Meetings running up against each other. I'm just excited that you're all here. We're excited by this policy platform. A shout out to Ryan, who has just done a great job in terms of gathering information. And I hope that you've seen the synthesis of information across this platform. I know he's going to dive into the breadth and depth of this platform and how to use this platform as both local agencies and state associations, and how we lean into this as a network. It has been a network-wide process that truly has engaged voices differently than we have in the previous 2 iterations of our policy platform. So we still thank all of you in the network for stepping up as well and adding your voice to this process. But Ryan, again, just congratulations on this platform. We can't wait to see what the network does with it alongside your other pillars that you have or will be talking about. I think there's so many opportunities here. So with that, I'm going to go back on mute.
Sure. Thanks, Denise. Okay, so some of the, basically for all of the national listening sessions and then the survey, we also had folks rate how well they thought that the 2021-2022 priorities aligned with their values. And these were the averages that we received from those 100 plus individuals and organizations. So fairly consistent across the board. We were very happy with the 2 numbers at the top, the community action values and also NCAP values. And then folks also had an opportunity to say if they aligned with organization values and personal values. You can go to the next slide, please. So these were just some of the feedback, overall sort of like high level overview of the feedback that we received on strengths, what to improve and ways to grow. Folks liked that it was comprehensive, it wasn't afraid to take strong positions. Improvements, I think folks really were looking for, how do we use these priorities? How do they relate to the work that we're doing on the ground in communities? I think that was probably the top feedback we received for improvements. Also on specific substantive issues, folks were looking for more climate change or climate crisis items, as well as a greatly expanded immigration section. And then ways to grow. We really heard people say like, we wanted this to be more of like a living document almost, so more routine opportunities for the network to weigh in during that 2-year period that the policy priorities cover, and then more tools and trainings, especially for specific audiences. Next slide, please. So the priorities we're going to review today are part of a larger strategy that we're developing that are going to be these 3 sort of like policy and advocacy pillars. So we have these policy priorities that we're going over today. Those are more like the substantive, what do we stand for? What is our platform? And then we also have coming out later in the summer or early fall, policy intersection. So a 1-page document that sort of documents or visualizes how different policies fit together. I think we're envisioning this as a great sort of like drop off if you're ever at a legislative office or talking to policymakers, just so folks can see how all of the different community action programs and services fit together and why community action is so important to the integration of those services. And then also in response to the need for advocacy tools, we're going to do sort of like a primer, maybe an advocacy manual of some kind that can sort of give folks concrete examples of how they can implement these policy priorities and the policy intersections in their communities. Next slide, please. Okay, so the moment we've all been waiting for. So these are the National Community Action Partnership Public Policy Priorities for 2023-24. I can also pop a link to these in the chat. They're up on our website right now. And this is the cover. Shout out to Andy Pavey, who did the formatting and design of this, because I think they came out great, just saying. So we can go to the next slide, please. So right off the top, we have the promise and the mission here on the first inside pages. I really like having the mission here as well as the promise, just because it outlines our commitment to strengthen, promote the network, and we really think that these policy priorities are going to help NCAP fulfill that mission. Next slide, please. So this is the forward. We're really focusing on poverty as a policy choice. So policies that were created and the systems that were created by those policies exacerbate inequity, injustice, and the exploitation of the poor. And that policies don't really, poverty is not naturally occurring. It's the result of policy choices that have been made for decades and sometimes centuries. So that's sort of like the state of poverty, but then also we wanted to talk about the experience of poverty or experiencing low incomes in America. So we talk a bit about how it's a multidimensional human experience, it's mutable, and community action believes that the systems that those policies created that are inequitable, as well as the people in those systems, have the capacity for change. So that's sort of how we're framing this new set of policy priorities. Next slide, please. These haven't changed much, as you can imagine. So these are the policy areas, the overall sort of like umbrella topics. And we're going to walk through these, so I don't have to go through them right now. The only note I will make here is that we did add climate change to community resilience. So it's sort of like a climate crisis / community resilience section. Other than that, they remain pretty similar. Next slide. So one new thing in the priorities are we did a few highlights or box outs. So these were items that didn't necessarily fit completely into a policy category. They sort of spanned categories or applied to all of them. So we decided to do these highlight pages. So one of them is right up front. It's how to use these priorities, which we'll talk about in just a moment. Then we have one on updating federal poverty measurements, another highlight on the social determinants of health, one on tribal and native populations and issues affecting those communities. And then we also have a highlight on centering a whole family approach to providing human services. Next slide, please. So how to use these priorities. Essentially, I won't read through all of these, but we always envision these policy priorities as a reference document, as a point of reference. If you're starting advocacy work or if you're starting policy work, this is a great resource for that. Also, it's a great resource for finding out additional information. So this is the first time that throughout the document we've hyperlinked. Anytime there's like a statement of fact or like studies have shown, we've linked there so people can find those additional resources. And just want to note this last item is that we don't really view this as a document or a set of priorities to be adopted or discarded completely by an agency. It's really more like a buffet style where you can like pick and choose which policies to focus on, which ones make sense for your communities, and how you're going to implement those changes. So that's sort of how we view this. And within the document, there are a couple examples, like real world examples of how we envision that use happening. Next slide, please. I also don't have to go through this whole list. This is just a high level overview of some of the updates and changes that we've included. We're going to hit on each of these as we go through the sections, but just wanted them all here in one spot. We can go to the next slide. Okay, so the first item right out the gate, of course, is the Community Services Block Grant. We note the tireless work of NCAP on both reauthorization and also regular and supplementary appropriations. Those are some of the current issues that we're facing. Most of those are probably not news to anyone. The NCAP fiscal year 24 request, official request, is $770 million for the block grant, which is the same as FY23. And those Dear Colleague letters are out and circulating, and they're available on the NCAP website as well. And you can go to the next slide. Just wanted to give folks a overview of the CSBG appropriations over the past 15 years or so. So it starts in 08 and goes all the way up through 23 there, the last yellow bar. You see ARA and CARES there, the two red bars, and then the last blue bar, or the filled in solid blue bar, is what the president requested in his FY24 budget, which was flat funding, so 770, which is exactly what NCAF requested. And then I have these two outlines here. This is possible under the bipartisan budget deal that they just released. So it would be essentially the potential for flat funding in 24, and then a 1% increase cap on 25. And I just want to stress, though, that these are, the numbers in the bipartisan deal are like huge top line numbers. So it doesn't mean necessarily that each program or service or block grant is going to have the same treatment under, like, as you dig in under the hood under those top line numbers. So, but these are just like possible 24, 25 sort of like estimates or areas where we could be. You can go to the next slide, please. So the first section after the CSBG is economic justice. Each category, this is very similar to 21-22. Each category has sort of a value statement or a short introductory paragraph at the beginning that could provide folks with some talking points or ways to frame discussions with policymakers. So the one for economic justice is that our economy must work for all members of our communities, regardless of wealth or historical marginalization. And then on the next slide, we'll see a list of all the things in this section. I won't mention all these. I do just want to touch really quickly on direct cash assistance and nutrition assistance. So work requirements are touched on in this document. So I think that's helpful just because of the changes that we're probably going to see once this new bipartisan budget deal becomes law, hopefully by the time that we default on Monday. And then I also wanted to talk about financial capacity. So that's something fairly new in this version. And that relates to building assets, universal child savings accounts. NCAP has endorsed a bill in Congress by Senator Booker and Representative Presley about baby bonds that was spearheaded by Prosperity Now. So we're excited about that. And we can go to the next slide. So this is where the highlight for the centering whole family approach appears, right after economic equity, so pretty close to the front, integrating and aligning outcome-based services. This probably isn't new to folks, hopefully, on this webinar, but you know, a family or a household's needs evolve over time. So this highlight really tries to focus on the aspects of providing a whole family approach and what those benefits are. We can go to the next slide, please. The section after that is safe and affordable housing. So including expanding current housing production and as well as assistance programs and addressing and enforcing housing discrimination. Enforcing housing discrimination prohibitions, I should say, and strengthening protections for all consumers. You can go to the next slide and we'll see some of the housing items here. Expanding rental assistance, preventing eviction, instability, and homelessness. We've also endorsed a bill by Senator Michael Bennet and others that includes an emergency fund for evictions, community courts to make it easier for folks to get representation and have their cases decided quickly, as well as a lot of increased disaggregated data collection on evictions and how often they occur, who they're occurring to. So we're excited about supporting that bill as well. I also want to note that ending appraisal bias and disparities in home ownership is a new item for this set of policy priorities. There was just, time is like a flat circle. So I honestly don't even remember when this report was released. I want to say like last fall, pretty recently, by an interagency working group within the United States government about how real both appraisal bias and its effects are on communities and how it prevents building intergenerational wealth. So definitely something to check out there. We can go to the next slide, please. So the next highlight is updating federal poverty measurements. I don't have to tell folks that it sort of feels like poverty is having a moment. We have these new couple books like bestsellers came out, Matthew Desmond's book, Poverty by America, and there's a couple of other things in the works happening as well. So this section addresses alternate poverty measurement tools that provide a more accurate and honest representation of who's being most affected by economic hardship in our communities. You know, the official poverty measurement was created, you know, over 50 years ago, and it's based on food costs, as many of you know. And so this sort of talks briefly about how we got where we are, why it's inaccurate. We're going to be coming out with a longer policy brief, hopefully in June, that discusses some alternates or alternatives to the official and supplemental poverty measures. So take a look or keep an eye out for that. But we just wanted to make sure that this was addressed head on somewhere in these policy priorities. Next slide, please. So the section after that is education and workforce. We're really focusing on equal access to all levels of education and training programs. You can go to the next slide, please, and we'll look at some of the items here under education and workforce. Certainly, I want to mention early childhood education. Many community action agencies run Head Start programs, which are facing, I'm going to say, unprecedented workforce challenges. So that's addressed here, as well as some other fixes or some other policies that we support related to Head Start and early childhood education programs. And then a lot of these other items were in previously. I also do want to highlight promoting community schools. That was mentioned by a few different pieces of feedback that we got, just in terms of education, curricula, meeting students where they are, you know, having curricula be community-based, as well as exposing students to like diverse opinions and experiences, both within their community and outside their communities. So wanted to highlight that as well. We can go to the next slide, please. After that, we have universal health and well-being. Meaningful access to quality, affordable healthcare is a human right. We can go to the next slide and take a look at some of the items here. So there's a much longer, these are sort of like longer pieces in this section. Universal health coverage talks about community health centers, closing the Medicaid coverage gap. And then we have a long section on mental health and substance use services. This is, I think, the last or second to last day of Mental Health Awareness Month. And we also have a policy brief on that, which folks can check out from last year, but that includes a lot of resources. And then only other thing I wanted to mention here is affordable prescription drugs. We do come out in support of the federal government being able to negotiate drug prices for Medicare, which was part of the Inflation Reduction Act, and then also supporting a cap on insulin costs for private companies as well as, or private insurers as well as Medicare. So that's in there as well. And we can go to the next slide. So this is where the social determinants of health comes into play, or this is where the highlight exists in the policy priorities. Basically, we're here supporting cross-industry interdisciplinary efforts to address social determinants that have a profound effect on the health and well-being of low-income individuals and families. So essentially, this section is saying health doesn't exist in a vacuum. There are structural inequities that, and those are the social determinants of health, like inequitably distributed resources and other social determinants that lead to greater and greater social needs within communities. So we wanted to make sure that this was pulled out and addressed explicitly, that this is an issue that a lot of our communities are dealing with. We can go to the next slide. After that, this is the new or sort of new or greatly expanded climate crisis section. So this is taken directly from a statement that we released last year. The Community Action Network is deeply attuned to the disproportionate impact of climate change on people experiencing low incomes and historically marginalized communities. We tried to get a little bit into the weeds, but not too far, because it can get very weedy pretty quickly in this area. So we can go to the next slide and we'll go over some of these items that got added to the climate crisis section. And I'll go through some of these, just a few more of them than in the other sections, just because they're brand new. Incentivizing systemic equitable approaches to preparedness, prioritizing environmental justice, might be addressed other places here, but that includes protection as well as redressing past harms, clean energy permitting processes, low-income community solar projects, targeted clean energy workforce training programs, zero emission vehicle incentives. I think that'll come up in a moment in as well in public transit as well, zero emission systems, integrating climate change mitigation into housing projects, the research on health effects of climate change on low-income communities, connecting tribes through expanded electric grids and broadband access, and then also rapid response, including equitable funding triggered by emergency declarations in states or even at the federal level, and really making sure that those responses or the distribution of resources is equitable in the aftermath of a emergency. I also wanted to mention here that this section also talks about, and I think the energy section as well, speak about basically the equitable implementation of both the bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act. So there were a lot of like new funds, new opportunities, new programs flying around in both of those bills. And so one of the priorities here is just to make sure that everyone has equal access to benefiting from those opportunities. Next slide, please. So here's energy, water, and infrastructure. Equitable access to affordable utility services, secure grids, and reliable infrastructure is paramount to community adaptability and resilience, especially for disproportionately impacted low-income communities and communities of color. I think this really relates to the climate crisis section, just in the sense that we always knew that some of these utilities were absolutely necessary, but now I think the pandemic has really demonstrated how necessary some of these really are. Certainly broadband, having telehealth access, some of those other items. We can go to the next slide and we'll dig in a little bit deeper. So this includes items like weatherization, We support NCAP's work on the bills that were recently reintroduced in Congress. The Weatherization Improvement Act that would increase average cost per unit. There's workforce training items in there. And then we also wanted to talk about QCI certification barriers. That's something that a lot of agencies have dealt with. This section also relates to, or also includes the Low-Income Home Energy Assistance Program, or LIHEAP. Also, we wanted to make sure that we voiced support for not just water rights generally, but also for the LIWAP program, and then also broadband access and public transportation. We can go to the next slide. So this is where the tribal communities highlight is. It's 2 pages, and it sort of tries to give a high-level overview of a little bit of history, just in the sense of like the history of violence and systemic racism against tribal populations, the history of tribal sovereignty. So it walks through that a little bit and then gets into some demographics about the state of tribal communities today, and then steps through some things that NCAP supports, including preserving and lifting up Indigenous history, culture, and achievements, making sure that tribal sovereignty is safeguarded. We've seen a few attempts recently to sort of like either cut down or try to whittle away at tribal sovereignty. The ICWA case is still to come out. The Indian Child Welfare Act is before the Supreme Court, so that opinion hasn't come out yet. Some water rights issues, other attempts to sort of like short circuit tribal sovereignty. So we come out against those. And then also making sure that folks who are reading the priorities know that tribal communities aren't a monolith. So as far as policy design and advocacy goes, we wanted to make sure that design elements that specifically benefit unique tribal needs and the implementation of those policies really need to be community-based to make sure that they're meeting the needs of whatever community they're affecting. We can go to the next slide. So this is the civic engagement section. Basically, there are 3 main parts here, but certainly this references the history of advocacy in the Community Action Network, as well as the maximum feasible participation of low-income communities and individuals. The value statement here is participatory democracy depends on civic engagement and extending an equal opportunity for engagement to every member of the community. So if we go to the next slide, we can step through some of these items here. So certainly preserving voting rights. We've seen an unprecedented amount of state level bills that like restrict voting rights protections or restrict access to polling places in terms of hours, location, ballot drop boxes, other opportunities for people to vote. We also have fair districting here. So fair districting processes and practices that keep communities of interest intact. That includes support for independent redistricting commissions. Then we also have civic education, transparency and input in the policymaking process. I will say that the partnership just signed on to a set of comments from the leadership conference about modernizing like the regulatory process at the federal level. So the Office of Management and Budget at the White House is sort of trying to revamp how the regulatory process is fulfilled at the federal level. And they're trying to include more community engagement, making sure that people really have an opportunity to weigh in on these policy and regulatory reforms before they're implemented so that people know how they're going to affect communities, including even meeting with opportunities to meet with agency representatives as opposed to just submitting comments online. There's some interesting things in there. So we wanted to make sure that we, in this document, came out in support of that transparency and robust input in the policymaking and regulatory process. I sort of already mentioned the increasing accessibility to the polls. We also have polling accommodations and protections for people living with disabilities and members of language minorities, which are already required by law, but not necessarily enforced the way they should be. And then also increasing funding for election administration and poll worker training. So we have those items in there as well. Go to the next slide, please. So public safety and criminal justice reform, the current contours of our criminal justice system are not equitable. These are, we can go to the next slide. These sort of try to address all different aspects of the criminal justice system, especially those that disproportionately affect people living with low income. So first, right out of the gate, we have police reforms. We I think our board approved these in 2021 or maybe even late 2020, if I'm remembering correctly. Most of these have to do with use of force. So use of force restrictions, no-knock warrants. But then there's also things like qualified immunity, making sure that we have national misconduct data, as well as police militarization. Section 1331 allows the Department of Defense to sell certain militarized equipment to local law enforcement agencies. So we wanted to oppose that. For returning citizens, reentry programs and ban the box for housing and employment applications, as well as expunging records and restoring the right to vote. I will say we're tracking a bill in Congress right now that would prevent prison gerrymandering, which is basically the fact that the census counts incarcerated individuals where they're incarcerated as opposed to in their home communities, meaning that when redistricting happens, additional resources are sent to places with prisons as opposed to the home communities of the people who are incarcerated, which often need them more. So we are tracking that bill moving through Congress as well. We have items here about addressing juvenile justice, which includes increasing the age of majority in some situations or for some offenses, as well as expunging nonviolent criminal records. And then removing fines and fees. This has gained quite a bit of traction in the past couple of years. So just all the fines and fees related to moving through the criminal justice system can not only be onerous, but then if you miss a payment or can't pay it, then there's fines on top of the fees and that piles up. And obviously, you know, the amounts are universal, so they disproportionately impact people living with low incomes. Speaking of, there's also bail reform items in here because bail systems that are based on like cash bail systems exploit the poor, because basically if there's a bail amount for a certain offense or a certain type of defendant, certainly someone with more means is going to be able to pay that bond and then await trial out of jail, as opposed to someone who can't pay it and now they're in jail for months and months waiting for trial. So we came out opposing that. Shrinking the carceral state in various ways. So there we have things like pretrial diversion programs, restorative justice, community groups, mental health as first responders, and then abolishing for-profit or private prisons. And we can go to the next slide. Okay, so this is basically in the immigration section that we had before. We talked about a few different items, I think maybe only 2 items. DACA was certainly at the top of the list, but this is a much expanded and strengthened immigration section. It also includes asylum issues. So the statement here is diverse voices and experiences from all over the globe have always made our communities stronger and more prosperous. We can go to the next slide, check out some of the new items here. So certainly first, which was included in the last edition, codifying DACA. I will say, you know, my gosh, like what a long tortured path DACA has had. But there was a final rule that essentially codified DACA in a regulation, but there's currently a court opinion that says that they can't accept any new DACA sort of like enrollees or recipients. So they're renewing people's DACA certification, but not accepting anyone new. So still kind of in limbo. It feels like things keep happening, but they don't really lead to the program not being in limbo, which is frustrating. So strong statement supporting the codification of DACA in here. We also have items about ensuring asylum rights. So re-emphasizing that all people have the right to seek asylum in the United States. And also we speak about conditions on the ground when they enter the country, and also the rights that they have as they're moving through the asylum process. We also have expanding eligibility for government services and work rules. We're tracking a pair of bills, one in the House, one in the Senate, that are moving through Congress right now. And when I say moving through Congress, I mean they've been filed, and that's it for now. But they would lift the 5-year ban on certain programs and services for undocumented individuals and their families, including mixed status families. We have public charge outreach right here, but I think this outreach really applies to everything in this section. I think there's just a lot of confusion. It's a complicated area of law and policy, and just voicing support for making sure that the public is educated, outreach to affected communities on all of these immigration issues. Certainly public charge, there was a new public charge rule that was released and finalized. And then it's so hard to keep track of Congressional Review Act actions or Congress repealing regulations, which they have the power to do. So I know that this was passed, that the House passed a repeal of the new public charge law. I don't think the Senate has passed it yet, but the administration has said that President Biden will veto it if it comes to his desk, but not quite as tortured as DACA, but also a long road for that public charge regulation. So we also address raising visa caps, creating a pathway to citizenship or permanent residency, the ability for undocumented individuals to get driver's licenses in their states. Another local issue is expanding voting rights. So municipalities have the ability to let undocumented individuals vote in local elections, which more than a handful have done. I know Cambridge, Massachusetts is one, and there are others. So we wanted to make sure we put that here. And then shout out to Santa Cruz that brought this to my attention about transitioning immigration courts to Article 1 courts. So the immigration courts are run by the Department of Justice, which is a political, it's a politically appointed department. So this policy would move those courts to instead be Article 1 courts that are overseen by Congress. So they wouldn't be Article 3 courts like a normal U.S. District Court or a Court of Appeals, but they would be an Article 1 court with actual judges, sort of like the tax court or bankruptcy court at the federal level. So it would essentially remove immigration courts from the political process and make them independent judges. Okay, we can go to the next slide. Oh, since we're here, just wanted to give folks a high-level overview of the Fiscal Responsibility Act. That's the bipartisan budget deal that they're working through right now. The White House, I think, is having a briefing right after this, and also right after this, the House Rules Committee is meeting to debate the rule on the bill. So we'll see what happens. But these are just sort of like the very, very high-level items here on debt budget, the SNAP and TANF restrictions, and also some miscellaneous items like permitting reform, student loan repayment pause resumes. They basically did what the administration said they would do anyway, which was reinstate the student loan payments 60 days after, essentially after the Supreme Court is about to rule in the next like 30 days or so on whether or not the Department of Education student loan forgiveness program was legal or not. And so the administration said they would resume payments 60 days after the Supreme Court ruled, essentially. So this bill would reinstitute payments basically on September 1st. So it would be around the same time. There's also an administration pay-as-you-go rule, which I don't know if anyone's familiar with the pay-as-you-go rule in Congress. It's a little bit different in the House and the Senate. They have sort of different versions, but essentially it means that you can't really spend money unless you're also offsetting it somehow. I will say this administration version has a bunch of waivers and exceptions that OMB can institute on their own, essentially. So it doesn't have too many teeth, but I think it was more like a principled stand for the administration or for House Republicans to try to reel in administration spending. I do also want to mention, oh, here it is. I was like, how did I not put this on here? Over on the left, there's $30 billion in COVID clawback. And that includes things like money left over in emergency rental assistance. There's rural development money in there, vaccines, public health. You know, some of the items there are more directly related to COVID in the sense that, so it'll be things like, you know, an operating budget for the Department of Labor to help states with, you know, greatly expanded unemployment insurance, which no longer exists. So things like that, or a couple of SBA items for emergency loans that were directly related to the pandemic. But some of the things really are human service related. So just wanted to note that here in this webinar. And we can go to the next slide. So these are just policy resources that I always put together. We have a landing page. We have policy spotlights on various policy areas, sort of, and how they affect people living with low incomes. We have one on mental health awareness. We have one on domestic violence, LGBTQ issues, fair housing, a couple of other items as well. We have 2 civic engagement related briefs, one on fair districting and one also on protecting voting rights. And as I mentioned earlier, we're going to be coming out with a sort of like long form policy brief on poverty measurements. It's almost done, hopefully sometime in June. And then certainly Congress, the White House briefing room, the Federal Register. The Congressional Research Service is absolutely necessary for any sort of policy research. And then the National Conference of State Legislatures is a great resource for anything happening at the state level, but they also do federal items. In fact, they have a chart of all of the Congressional Review Act bills that are moving through where Congress is trying to repeal actions by the administration. So they have a whole tracker there of things, of those items and where they are in the process. And then the National Council of Nonprofits and Policy Source. Next slide, please. It's like a obligatory Hamilton reference, the room where it happens. So just wanted to note NCAP's work here, appropriation requests. They have free membership. So if you're not a member, go sign up. They can help agencies with advocacy strategies and are always happy to do so, especially at the federal level. They have CAP briefs, CAP facts, which is right here. That's the QR code. And then David Bradley also started doing coffee chats. I think they're once a month on Fridays, but those are great as well. Those are under the events section of their website. And I can actually put a link in there too. But just wanted to note that. You can go to the next slide, please. This is the CAP Law Training Conference, just shameless plug. And then the next slide is also for our conference in Atlanta that's coming up at the end of August. And you can go to the next slide. And that's it. So we're up to questions. I'm happy to answer. I might put a couple of links in the chat about things that I spoke about, but also happy to answer any questions that folks may have. Haven't really been totally paying attention to the chat, but I can do that now. Feel free to pop a question in the chat. I'll also put my email here. I'll also put a link to, oh yeah, go ahead, I'm sorry.
I'll pose a question that came in through the Q&A for you.
Oh yeah, thank you.
Is there a way to have states highlight the work that they're doing in individual states in some of these issue areas at the state and local levels? Some states are really making some really great progress, and maybe there's ways to share information. And could there be a tool that ties to this document in some way that, again, shares those efforts?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things that we're looking at is having like expanding communication between the national partnership and state associations as well as agencies about work going on in the states. So, and also at the local level, certainly municipalities as well. So keep an eye out. You can always email me if you're just looking to share. I'm always happy to receive that information because it's impossible to keep track of everything going on, especially at the state level. So I'll put my email in there as well for folks to email me. But we are looking at some sort of at least partially formalized, maybe quarterly group to discuss policies that are happening or changing at the state level. And creating a space for that communication to happen on a regular basis. So that is something that we're looking into. Please feel free to email me separately about that, and I can make sure specifically to keep folks in the loop who are very interested. But that was part of the feedback that we received as well. So we're really looking into trying to make that happen for folks.
Thanks. Another question is, can we have a one-pager on how to work with different political spheres? They specifically mention perhaps a deeply red supermajority legislature. Is there tips of the trade? And I know NCAP has done some training on that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I will say like NCAP has great workshops on how to talk to various constituencies in the legislature. So not just Congress, but they really would apply anywhere. How to talk to different sort of like factions. So I would check out those workshops for sure. And I can post here, I'll post both of these NCAP links here. And they have a lot of great information for sure. And they're honestly the folks to go to because they really know, I feel like David is talking to people constantly, right? So he's talking to legislators all the time. He knows what works, he knows what doesn't work. So I really would encourage folks to look at those workshops because they really are very helpful. We don't really have anything specifically towards that right now, but that is something that keeps coming up again and again. So I feel like we probably will end up putting something together. I don't know what form that might take or what exactly it'll address or include, but I know that's on a lot of folks' minds. And so that's also something that we're going to look into just in terms of, how can we provide the network with appropriate resources for doing that kind of work in conjunction with all the resources that NCAP is providing as well.
Thanks. And we'll also try to lift up, right, a variety of local examples or state association examples, because it can be challenging sometimes to make the arguments. And you as local agencies certainly know your both state house members and your congressional members best, and what's going to carry and what's not going to carry any water in those conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
And I'm going to have to scoot here, but another question to give to you, Ryan, that came through, and we chat a little bit about it in the Q&A box. The question around voter registration, civic engagement. I put the link to Boulder Advocacy in the chat for folks to get familiar with some of their advocacy tools and resources, which are fantastic, but certainly there are nuances when it comes to CSBG and voter registration. So we could talk a little bit about how we navigate that a little bit, and certainly the tools with CAP law.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's it, right? So so certainly voter engagement is really important. Just engagement generally, just getting folks engaged in the civic process or the political process is huge. Empowering them to use their voices to create change. Boulder Advocacy is a great resource. They have a lot of really great webinars, as well as briefs or one-pagers about how specifically nonprofits can get involved in civic engagement as well as voter registration. I will say the voter registration provision in the CSBG Act does create an extra wrinkle, as you said, Denise. But Cap Law has some great resources out there on that. They actually have it's basically, yeah, like a one-pager on voter registration do's and don'ts for agencies. It's not really a provision that's been tested necessarily as far as the statute. So, but you know, we certainly trust Cap Law as far as how they interpret the statute and what kind of responsibilities and prohibitions it creates for agencies. So I would check that out. They also have other election sort of like season resources on there for engaging in ways that are allowed under the statute. So definitely check that out. And I think Denise had to, oh yeah, she hopped off. But any other questions? We got like a couple minutes here. Feel free to put them in the chat or in the Q&A, or you can just email me. I'm always happy to talk policy with anybody at any time, to be honest. The other thing that I would mention is that, you know, we do a policy bulletin every month. So, and it would be so great to include like not just things from local agencies, but also things that are going on at the state level that local agencies are involved with. So if you have something like that, please let me know, because it would be great to include it in the bulletin and get some of that work out there, because I know people are doing it. Like I know agencies are involved in so many of these coalitions and campaigns. So it would be great to let the network know, and just to create like a space to like share best practices or share what other people are doing. It can be really motivational. So I'll just throw that out there. Yeah, it is very comprehensive. Thanks, Jerome. Thanks everyone for the comments. There's a lot going on. So in the policy priorities. So if you do have any questions about anything that I talked about today, or anything in the policy priorities, please let me know. And keep an eye out for those other products that I mentioned. We're going to do alternative poverty measurements in the next month or so. And then towards the end of the summer, we're also going to be coming out with that policy intersections document, as well as some advocacy materials. So just keep an eye out. And please email me if you're interested in being part of any sort of a policy like working group or body or commission or something that meets on a regular basis to exchange policy information going on in states, or to just communicate about different policies facing your organizations, because we'd like to get folks involved as soon as we decide what that's going to look like. So, okay, great. Well, thank you so much, everyone. Oh, also, I should have mentioned right at the top, most important question, these slides will be available on the website. We'll email them out to everyone that was here, but they'll also be available on the website, as well as a recording of this webinar. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us this afternoon. And again, please email me with any questions or anything I can ever do for your organizations as far as policy or advocacy is concerned. So thank you so much and have a great day.